A Conservative MP has proposed a ban on cousin marriage. Now, the Labour Party has responded to this, saying that they're really not sure. They're going to have a think about it. But a Muslim MP, a pro-Palestine MP, Iqbal Muhammad, spoke in the House of Commons on the topic, defending cousin marriage. And here he is.
An estimated 35 to 50% of all sub-Saharan African populations either prefer or accept cousin marriages, and it is extremely common in the Middle East and in South Asia. The reason the practice is so common is that ordinary people see family intermarriage overall as something that is very positive, something that helps build family bonds and helps put families on a more secure financial foothold. However, as is well documented, it is not without health risks for the children of those relationships, some of whom will be born out of wedlock. Instead of stigmatizing those who are in cousin marriages or those inclined to be, a much more positive approach would be to facilitate advanced genetic test screening for prospective married couples, as is the case in all Arab countries in the Persian Gulf, and more generally to run health education programs targeting those communities where the practice is most common.
As usual, I'm going to try and say some sensible things on this topic. There's been a lot of, well, maybe not quite hysteria, but excitement in the alternative media in particular on this topic. But let's try and think about it from the beginning. Right, incest. What is wrong with incest? Well, I think there's four angles we can come at this from. Number one, intuition. I just know. Sexual relations between people of a certain relatedness are just wrong. My conscience tells me, and I take that seriously. So there's intuition, and there's a moral element to it. Right, genetics. I think obviously sexual relationships with people that are closely related are strongly correlated with genetic problems in offspring. So that's another serious issue to consider. Another crucial one is if the barriers between relationships between close family members are broken down, then that makes the family home a dangerous place, particularly for younger people, for children, for example. Whereas if these types of sexual relationships are just absolutely taboo or illegal, then that preserves the family home or the family environment as a place safe from sexual predation, let's call it that. And the last one, I used to say there's three reasons. I've actually come across a fourth one relatively recently. And the fourth reason against incest is to discourage tribalism within a society. By tribalism, I mean a group of very extended family that's very closely tied to each other, and that's where their primary loyalty is. And then you have these big tribal groups, if you like, and they have feuds with each other. You can have vast inequalities as one of these groups gathers wealth and another one is excluded from that. And also some of the central figure or figures within these tribal groups can become immensely powerful, and they've only got there by having lots of kids and managing to control their own family as it developed with these sort of inbreeding relationships. So I think a tribal society is not a healthy one in lots of ways. And I think if families have to intermingle more, then you have a more equal and united society, so rather than competing tribal extended family groups. So I think the intuition against incest is not arbitrary. I mean, moral standards are never arbitrary. There's always a reason for them, and if you look at how they play out, if they're ignored, if they're flouted, then problems ensue, and we can see what those problems are when it comes to incest. Now, the law in Scotland about incest is similar, actually, to the law about marriage. So you're not allowed to marry people with a certain relationship, and also sexual relationships with people of a certain relationship are not allowed. And the list is basically the same. So it's parent and child, including adoptive, grandparent, grandchild, siblings, including half siblings, uncle, aunt, nephew, niece. Now that list basically is straight out of the book of Deuteronomy from the Bible, and it's still the foundation of the law in England and Scotland. But it is under attack. It is under attack. It's not a mainstream movement yet, but it's been nibbled at the edges. There are people who say, our revulsion at incest, well, that's just, it's the yuck factor. It's irrational. It's just some strange societal taboo that we need to be more rational and overcome. There was a petition presented to the Scottish Parliament a few years ago suggesting legalisation of incest, and there are some indications in our culture, in TV shows, for example, TV dramas, where they're just introducing incestuous stories. Now, they may say, okay, they're not showing them in a positive light. Well, that's a bit debatable. So I think we're in the early stages of a push towards cultural acceptance of incest. Now, to be honest, they should be pushing at an open door, because we've been hearing for decades, love is love, you've got the right to love who you like. So when there isn't any, well, there are the beginnings of a movement towards acceptance of incest. I believe it will gather strength. At the forefront of it, of course, or pushing it, will be the LGBT or queer movement. That will be the medium through which this campaign expresses itself. Now, those lists I just said, that cousins are not on the list. And historically, in a lot of cultures, it has been acceptable to marry cousins, and in lots of parts of the world now, it's acceptable to marry cousins. But thinking about it rationally, should they be on the list, basically? Should this be a prohibited relationship? Well, let's think about the 4 reasons that are stated why I think incest is wrong. Right, intuition. What does your intuition say? Does your conscience tell you that, like, cousins getting married, cousins having sex, that's just wrong? Well, mine certainly does. So intuition, yes. Genetics, yes. Very significant problems associated with cousin marriage. I'll talk about those in a little while. Making the family home safe, you could say that applies less. But if you've got a very sort of extended family sort of culture, well, maybe it does apply to some degree. But the last one, tribalism, well, that applies big time. If you allow cousin marriage, then you can allow like huge extended family tribes that are effectively going to develop in the society, and society will be then made up of a patchwork of these like tribal groups, if you like. So starting from those principles, does it seem like cousin relationships, marriage is wrong? Well, I would say it does. Now, if it's going to be made illegal, well, there's 2 things that could be made illegal. You could make marriage illegal, which is what's being proposed, or you could add it to the incest list and actually make the sexual relationship illegal. Now, I believe in stating that this marriage is illegal, effectively, surely that needs to be the same thing as saying that the sexual relationship is illegal. What's the point of making the marriage illegal if you're saying, obviously, well, just don't get married then, move in, have sex, have kids, whatever, just you're not allowed to get married? That doesn't seem to make sense to me. So if you're going to ban the marriage, then I think the sex between those people needs to be added to the incest list as well. If you don't do that, just a marriage ban on its own, it's going to achieve very little, I would suggest. And let's say, for example, in let's say Muslim communities, is it not quite likely they'd just say, okay, the state says you're not married, but we've done the ceremony at the mosque. As far as we're concerned and Allah's concerned, you're married. So who cares about the law? So I feel that law alone would be pretty ineffective. Having said that, I mean, it sends a message, doesn't it? It's a cultural expression of a moral standard by the fact that that law exists. But in practice, I'm not sure how effective it would be. Now, Iqbal's got another solution. He's saying, no, it shouldn't be made illegal. What we need is genetic testing. Well, first of all, say with that, who's going to pay for that? So a massive expense imposed on the NHS in order to accommodate this cultural practice. Again, the idea of genetic testing, that seems to be implying an arranged marriage system, doesn't it? You can't really have a system where 2 people just meet each other, fall in love, one proposes, they decide to get married, they say, okay, we better go and get our genetic test now, hadn't we? You go and get the genetic test, well, we can't get married after all because there's a risk that our children would suffer from some sort of deformity or illness. I mean, surely that's not a sensible system, is it? Surely in that situation, when the people have fallen in love and they're ready to get married, are they not more likely to say, well, let's go ahead in any case, maybe we'll risk it, maybe we'll adopt, I mean, who knows, maybe we'll use donors, who knows. That just seems a ridiculous system. That system only makes sense in the context of arranged marriages. So because, right, get your genetic test, right, this family over here, they get a genetic test for their daughter, this family gets a test for their son, then the family have a chat, how about our son marrying your daughter? Okay, let's check the test, shall we? They're okay. right, let's arrange the marriage. It only makes sense in that context. So genetic testing is the wrong solution. Similarly, education. I mean, when people have learned that, I mean, what does it, what do they do with the knowledge they've gained? All I can see that they would do is get genetically tested, which just reintroduces the same problem. The effects of cousin marriage, roughly, the research is quite complicated. They're not particularly clear-cut things, but there are disorders that are made much more likely with cousin marriage. And in terms of IQ, some people estimate that maybe there's an average loss of IQ of about 5 points, which I think is quite significant. Okay, that's not to be sniffed at. And you also need to think that these effects are cumulative. So if you've got generation after generation engaging in cousin marriage, then the genetic pool is narrowing and narrowing, and these problems are going to become more pronounced. Another concern that could be raised at this point is, I mean, is what I'm saying about genetics, does that amount to eugenics? Am I saying that I really want healthy children to be born and not unhealthy children, because healthy children are obviously more valuable than unhealthy children? If the genetics was the sole element, I think that would be a tricky issue to discuss. That would be an ongoing conversation. But with this issue, it's not just about the genetics. It's also an underlying moral principle, and there are the other factors as well. So I don't think it's vulnerable to the attack that this is sort of eugenics in disguise. I think this is a wider moral principle, and when the moral principle is adhered to, the outcomes are better for everyone. I think in Britain, the culture opposing cousin marriage needs to be upheld and strengthened, and people who've come here with other views, well, I think that culture needs to change. It needs to adapt to what's become the standard in Britain. And I think the law can play an important part in shaping culture, but it's not the whole story. I think also this needs to be discussed openly, and arguments need to be put forward in order to persuade people basically of the wisdom and rightness of the traditional British approach that has evolved here. Now, this is a classic case where immigration has resulted in importing a problem from other cultures, from other parts of the world. Now, obviously, let's say if 500,000 Scots moved to Saudi Arabia, people in Saudi Arabia would be quite quick to say, oh, for goodness sake, what have we done? What a mistake. We took 500,000 Scots. We've now got alcoholism problems. We've got drug problems. We've got antisocial behaviour problems. We've got graffiti all over the place. We've got people who are just dependent on the state. They don't want to work. Dear me, this is a big mistake importing these Scots. We'd have been better off without them. It'd be quite understandable if some people in Saudi Arabia did actually question, well, at least point out some of the downsides of mass immigration from Scotland. So I think it's perfectly reasonable within Scotland or within the UK to look at some problems that have been imported through immigration into our country. So my view is we need to minimise immigration for many years from now in order to allow integration to take place and to sort out some of these problems instead of still fueling them in some ways. Now, for some people, this sort of issue is an excuse to be able to have a go at immigrants or Muslims or whatever. What I'm saying here is not that at all, but it obviously is a genuine problem that has been imported into Britain, and steps need to be taken to try to resolve that problem. Now, when I was listening to Iqbal speaking in the Parliament, that part of me thought, I'm actually quite pleased he's there in the Parliament putting his point of view in the heart of national debate, and people will respond to him and there will be an open argument. Part of me thought that was a positive thing. On the other hand, part of me thinks, he just got elected on a pro-Palestine, basically a Muslim ticket. I don't think it's healthy to have Muslim MPs, that's what he basically is, in the Parliament, seeing their mission as promoting the cause of Muslims. I don't think that's healthy. But for different cultures to engage in open debate, I think is a good thing. Now, this is a tricky issue for Labour, isn't it? I mean, what are they going to say? It's so obvious that cousin marriage is problematic, but Labour do not want to upset a major constituency of their support that's already quite upset with them, i.e. Muslims. So, yeah, tricky one for Labour. The Scottish Conservative Party, tactically, it would be sensible for them to propose the same thing in Scotland, and then the SNP would have the same problem. They would find it very difficult to know how to reply to that. So, hope that was helpful and interesting. Do subscribe if you haven't already done so, and thanks for watching.